Hello there. If you could slowly but surely take your places now, we'll get started. Thank you very much. So, there she is. Okay. I welcome you on behalf of the Honors College, but the introduction will be made by my colleague here, who actually arranged for the speaker to come. So thank you.
Thank you. Wow, thank you everybody for coming. I am so glad to see such a robust audience here because this is really a great and wonderful occasion today. Our speaker, as you know, is Brooke Gladstone, co-host of NPR's show On the Media. And I think the best way to introduce her is to talk in terms of what she does for news consumers, like all of us. And I think in this nonstop cycle of news, commentary, and infotainment, people like Brooke Gladstone are more critical than ever because they give us thoughtful, insightful critiques of the media and help us sort of sort through the muck, okay? Every week, she helps people understand what's going on in our world by asking provocative questions and cutting through the muck with flair and wit. I'll just give you a sample of what was on her show this week. It's called, her show, by the way, is called On the Media. It's on the NPR station. You can hear it on WNYC, AM 820, right? And you can also get it on your laptop through onthemedia.org, okay? But this week's lineup included some really cool stuff, including what I thought was a very useful glossary to terms that you hear all the time when there's a breaking news story. Things like, we are receiving reports, which means that sources are claiming that something's happened, but it can't be confirmed. Or, we have learned, which is how a news outlet lets their listeners or their viewers know that they have a scoop. There was also a really wonderfully reported personal account by Brooke's producer, Sarah Abdurrahman, I hope I'm not butchering that name, about how she, her family, and her friends were detained for hours by U.S. Customs and Border Protection on their way home from a wedding in Canada. I thought the story really sort of put a spotlight on an agency of our government, the U.S. Border Patrol, that is one of the least transparent one of the least transparent government agencies in the United States right now. All the people involved in this detainment, by the way, were U.S. citizens, and they never really got a good explanation of why they were detained for 6 hours at the border in the first place. And the story was, not just well told, but also well reported. For people who are keeping mental notes on the impact of technology in society, there were two great interviews on the show this week. One was with a geographer who talked about map apps and the kinds of choices that are being made behind the scenes about what paths to lead you down. And also there was an interview with Clive Thompson, a journalist who specializes in technology, and he's come out with a new book called Smarter Than You Think, How Technology is Changing Our Minds for the Better. And for those of you who are doing your research roadmaps in Hum 101, you might want to take note of that title because it might help you with some of the articles that you may end up selecting. But anyway, Brooke is a graduate of the University of Vermont. She began her career in print journalism, and she joined NPR, which stands for National Public Radio, in 1987 and has been with On the Media since 2001. If you're not familiar with National Public Radio, or NPR as it's commonly termed, find an NPR station. There's one in Newark called WGBO. There's also one in New York City called WNYC. Start listening. I remember when I first discovered NPR back when I was like in my late teens, and I was like, wow, this is really awesome radio. Look at all the things you can do with it. Who thought that radio could could tell stories so well? And NPR, has a reputation for doing great reporting and making the most out of sound and one-on-one interviews. But anyway, let me just tell you a little bit about today's event. It grew out of a conversation with the Vector folks last spring. So I'd like to acknowledge the people from the Vector who are standing there in the back. Editor Romer Bedita, raise your hand. Managing Editor Yvonne Chen, raise your hand. Executive Editor Leonard Valenzuela, raise your hand. Business Manager Danielle Judka, who's not here anymore. She just had another engagement. She had to go run off and do something. And the Multimedia Editor Hari Ravichandran. Are you here? There's Hari. Thank you, you guys. However, none of this would be possible without the help of lots of other people from across campus. This is really a potluck, folks. We got, first and foremost, please thank Paul Dine over there, the person who introduced me of the Honors College. If he hadn't said yes to this colloquium, there would have been no colloquium. So thank you for the support from the Honors College. Also my boss, Carol Johnson. She's the chairperson of the Humanities Department, and the folks from the College of Science and Liberal Arts, the new dean, Jonathan Luke, and Charles Brooks, who is over there. So all these people contributed to making this happen. It really is one of these it takes a village kind of moments. Also, thank you to Bob Moran, I don't know if he's here, and Bill Dwelly, and all the folks from ITMS who are, making all the tech stuff work. I thought we would start by learning a little bit about Brooke's cartoon self. I will start by playing this short little video. And if the folks in the back could dim the lights, yeah, that's awesome. Okay, here we go. Here's a kind of a little entree into Brooke's book, The Influencing Machine.
Hi, I'm Brooke Gladstone, co-host of Public Radio's On the Media. Throughout the history of media, there is a recurring theme that the media are controlling our minds. With every new technology, the belief grows stronger that we are in the thrall of external devices. But I reject that idea. Consider the case of Natalia A., who is being treated by Victor Tausk, a disciple of Sigmund Freud. Natalia believes she is under the spell of an electrical apparatus operated by a rejected suitor. She's deaf and mute, so she writes her story down.
For 6 years he's tormented me. The power of his device extends all the way from Berlin to Vienna. I can see it. I can hear it. It's like a coffin lid, but with my shape. Whenever he strikes the machine, my body breaks. And whenever he twists the dial, my head aches. When he strokes the machine, I feel... My mother is controlled by a machine too. So are my friends. But they don't know it. They can't see it. I can't bear it. I want to run away. The machine is so simple now.
No arms, no legs, no sexual organs, no sexual feelings. No.
Tausk sees in Natalia a familiar syndrome whereby people project their own fantasies onto imaginary infernal devices. He writes his groundbreaking treatise on the origins of the influencing machine in schizophrenia.
The patient obviously seeks not to recognize herself in the influencing machine, and thus in self-protection, she disinvests it of all human features. In short, the less human the appearance of the delusion, the less does she recognize herself in it.
Tausk invents a new concept to describe what victims of the syndrome have lost: identity. They no longer know who they are. They have shattered themselves into fragments and projected the shameful bits onto the influencing machine. That is my metaphor for how we see the media. We feared the telegraph, the radio, the television, the computer. Heck, Socrates even disdained writing. But I believe the media are mirrors, a mess of mirrors, and what we fear is not the machine, but the reflection. Okay. Thank you guys for coming out. There were a couple of reasons why I wanted to play the video. First and foremost, my own informal survey suggests that you, like most people who see me for the first time, a substantial number of you are probably crushed that I'm not a black lesbian, and for that I am really sorry, because it's just too late. But that said, even though that's what Twitter keeps rediscovering over and over again, I'm delighted to be here. And there's another reason why I wanted to play it, which is because, A, I think it's a great compressed notion of what the book is about, and also because it helps explain, in a way, why I chose to write a comic book when I made the decision to empty my brain of all media thoughts after 25 years in the business. It takes an absurdly long time for me to form an opinion. It took me about 20 years about writing about the media to coalesce a view that was coherent enough to even call a view a kind of unified theory. And it seemed to me that the comic book format would be the best way to convey it. And this strikes people as very peculiar, because I'm in radio, that's the medium without pictures, but it isn't actually. Because more than television, more than newspapers, radio encompasses a kind of intimacy, this illusion of a one-to-one relationship that just doesn't exist in that other media. You really can feel the breath of the correspondent on your cheek. You're really dependent on the reporter to lead you through a story. Their words, even the smallest audio equivalent of a raised eyebrow, has so much impact on the radio because you are so close. When Al Franken did a public radio show for a while, he got some advice from his fellow Minnesotan Garrison Keillor, who told him, don't imagine that you're sitting right across, that your listeners sitting right across from you. You should imagine that he's in your lap. That's how close it is. And with comics, I would have the opportunity to actually look my reader in the eye, in a sense, and to speak in balloons, which are more colloquial. And because this is a non-sequential, pure, non-narrative argument, basically, about ideas, I come through it as your guide, like the ancients did, like Virgil in the Aeneid. And so I pop in and out. I'm in different forms. Sometimes I'm a dog. Sometimes I'm Medea. Sometimes I'm Spider-Man. I'm cards in the tarot deck. And the only person I didn't get to be is Buffy, and I'm still really disappointed about that. But that's another reason why I did a comic, because I love science fiction. So that is why I did a comic. And it was all to help explain a pretty complicated argument for a relatively simple idea, which is that if you go back a few millennia to the beginning of the written word, you'll see that we are changing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're dying as a civilization, even though many proclaim that the end is near. We are simply evolving. So the book begins and spends a lot of time on the discussion of knowing thyself. You may have heard that expression. It was supposedly carved on the temple of the Delphic oracle. Nobody knows for sure. It was reported by a passersby. It doesn't exist anymore. It may be the first untrue story in any media. But the Delphic oracle itself was a source of information. And if you start then and you look to now, what you see is that what was once a tiny trickle is now a flood. And it's all filtered. It's not just filtered by the people who produce the media, it is, most crucially, filtered by the people who consume the media, by us. In an era where everything can be asserted and anything denied, responsibility falls ever more heavily on each of us to know ourselves. And that involves the truly nauseating experience of constantly questioning beliefs that we accepted long ago. We have a trusty old stock of opinions, and when someone contradicts them, or facts contradict them, or they contradict each other, we are thrown into turmoil. The pragmatist William James observed at one point that at first, when faced with a contradiction, we tend to ignore it, or we abuse the people who pointed out the contradiction. But if you can't reconcile it, a person cannot remain forever in doubt. So we shave a little off of one opinion we hold dear, and we tinker a teeny bit with another just to make things consistent again. He wrote, "Our minds grow in spots, like grease spots. The spots spread, but we let them spread as little as possible. We keep unaltered as much of our old knowledge, as many of our old prejudices and beliefs as we can." So to the extent that we allow them to rule us, to wrap ourselves in a cozy cocoon of prejudice and received wisdom, cut off from potentially destabilizing new information, the degree that we do that is a matter of will. Now, that sounds kind of easy, but it's not easy. It's certainly not easy to defeat, because we are wired this way. These are absolute survival mechanisms that I'm asking you to examine and possibly block, evade, elude, or, well, it's never quite possible to destroy. We know, according to research, that choice, conscious choice, is usually an illusion, and it can lead you to wonder whether or not there really is such a thing as free will. There's a great experiment that was done in 2008 at the Planck Institute in Leipzig. Neuroscientists were trying to conduct a study to determine what happens in our brain right before we make a decision. So they had somebody watch a bunch of letters on a screen, and then they decided which button to press and when to press it. Watching the live brain scans, the researchers could predict the person's decision several seconds, maybe as many as 7 seconds, before the test subject themselves were even aware of making those decisions. Now, this is potentially a very big deal, because if we don't know that we've already decided, how can we apply reason to the choices we make? How can we circumvent our unconscious? When confronted with an increasingly fractious and fragmented news environment, and yeah, I am talking about the news environment here, because it's all that comes at you. And it used to be a question of the producers, of the suppliers, and now it's the opposite. There's such an abundance that it's all about choice. Everything you know about the world, or will know about the world, or can know about the world is determined almost entirely by you. Does that mean that a professional like me isn't responsible for what I do? Of course not. You know, I shouldn't lie, I should be fair, I should provide a stream of information, and with any luck, I'll prove fair and truly balanced most of the time, and you'll trust me. But fundamentally, it's up to you now. It's not up to me. So we have to know how we think. And what we know now is that we are driven far more by impulses and biases than we ever knew we had. Let me start with impulses, and I'll get through these pretty fast. But you know when you get butterflies in the stomach? You assume that your brain has sent a message down to your gut. But it's far more likely that your gut has actually sent the message up to the brain. It turns out that our gut, our intestinal tract, has a separate autonomous nervous system. It produces its own neurotransmitters, its own serotonin, its own dopamine. It makes its own decisions about the world. You may be seeing somebody and you think they're perfectly fine, but you get a really weird feeling. That feeling is through receptors coming from another part of your body. There was another great, another really amazing study. Test subjects. This was in 2008, researchers pretending to be fumbling with a bunch of stuff momentarily handed their cup of either hot or iced coffee to a person and then asked that person to rate an unknown person's personality based on some random information. Well, the test subject who was handed the hot cup rated that unknown person noticeably higher for warmth than the person holding the iced coffee. In another study, test subjects who held a hot therapeutic pad were more likely to choose a gift for a friend. When they held a cold pad, they chose something for themselves. How rational is that? And we can talk a little bit about biases here. Some of the biases have to, has everyone here heard of the gorilla experiment? I don't want to, go through it if you all know. Okay, well, for those who are unfamiliar, it goes like this. Participants, and there's a video on it, you can watch it online, it's preserved for all eternity. Participants were asked to watch a game in which members of two teams passed the ball to one another. The point is to count how many times the ball changes hands, how many times the person in the white shirt hands it to the person in the black shirt. Now, they're staring at the game, and while the test is happening, a man wearing a gorilla suit walks in front of the camera, beats his chest, and walks off. 50% of the participants did not see the gorilla, and he was standing right in front of them. If you look at the video, it looks crazy. It's impossible to miss. But the experiment revealed the power of our attention and how it overrides superfluous detail. It's called inattentional blindness. And you would think that, a radiologist who's used to looking carefully at a picture would do better at this. They handed a radiologist a scan of a person's brain, and prominently in the side was the picture of a gorilla. 80% of the radiologists didn't see it. Inattentional, and that's what we have to consider when we look at the world. I want to tell you about the smoking study. It's in the book. In the 60s, a bunch of students were put in a room with headphones, and they were listening to a story. Some of them smoked, and some of them didn't. The tape that they were listening to on headphones was deliberately poor quality. And when it got really staticky, they could push a button and clear the static for a few seconds, and then the static would come back. The smokers cleared the static on all the information that suggested that there was no link between cancer and smoking. The non-smokers cleared the static from the information that suggested there was such a link. This is a conscious, unconscious choice. This is a perfect metaphor for how we consume the media. In politics, it's the same thing. If you find out something about, let's say there are two candidates, one you love, one you hate. You find out something bad about the one you hate, the rational, according to fMRI studies, the rational part of your brain lights up and you reason and you form an opinion. You hear something bad about the candidate you love and the emotional centers light up all over the place, and none of the rational centers do. None of them. The circuits that mediated negative emotions like sadness and disgust are completely in play. And when, after this panic fireworks go on in your brain, you finally come up with some explanation, however specious it may be, for why your candidate did this terrible thing, you get a shot of dopamine. It's the same exact drug you get, same exact neurotransmitter you're hit with when you take cocaine. We are drugged into lying to ourselves. So when I say it's not easy to circumvent the system, it is absolutely right. Some studies suggest, well, one last study having to do with how we filter things. People will say, yeah, but, you know, I'll believe it when I see it. Well, as we know from the gorilla study, you might not see it. But what if you do see it? There's a cautionary tale that I took from Alan Baddeley's Your Memory, A User's Guide. The Australian eyewitness expert, Donald Thompson, once appeared on live TV to talk about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. Later, he was arrested, identified by a woman as the man who had raped her. Eventually, the investigators realized that the rape victim had been watching the program that he was on television when she was attacked. She had confused Thompson's face with the rapists, proving Thompson's point about eyewitness testimony. Obviously, he was thrilled. As for photos and documents, it's always been easy to doubt the truth of those. History is awash with dubious photos. There was a time when I felt like my entire job for my friends and family who are not in the media was to tell them that the picture of George Bush holding the book upside down or the phone upside down was photoshopped, or that, no, it wasn't really Sarah Palin in the bikini packing that rifle by the pool, and no, George Bush Sr. and Jr. were not fishing in the middle of New Orleans after Katrina, and so forth. We are experiencing, you know, the photoshopification of reality. And the biggest problem with it isn't so much that we'll believe false pictures, but that we won't believe documentation that's true. At least that's what I think. I was going to go into a study about that Harvard's been running for a long time. You can go online and find out by doing this very quick computer association thing how racist you are, how you know, anti-weight you are, how anti-ethnic you are, or any of that kind of thing. They've collected millions of people's responses at this point across the board. And they found that, you know, white people are mostly a little bit racist, and black people are also somewhat racist. I mean, and by racist here, I mean associating negative things with black faces. It's because of the culture that we're in. So everybody suffers from it. And if you know about it, then that's something else that you can put in your ammo belt as of knowing yourself, so that you don't filter or associate reflexively. Now, I'm going to speak for a moment as a practitioner, because there was, for a number of years, I was the senior editor of NPR's afternoon program called All Things Considered. And I had to make decisions about what went on the air. And every week there was an Amnesty International report of some really horrendous, horrible, heartbreaking thing that was happening somewhere. And they all sounded kind of the same. Now, as a normal human being, one would say, this has to go on the air. As the editor of a program that's on the air, you know, a couple of hours a day, and needs to offer a variety and hold people there. In other words, someone who isn't a human being, you start weighing things. You start parceling out those Amnesty International reports, because you're very conscious of something called compassion fatigue, and it's real. One of the most amazing studies that I've ever heard of examines that old saw that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. We've all heard that expression. It's an inescapable truth for those who are engaged in the enterprise of changing the world or reporting on the world. Social psychologist Paul Slovic got an inkling of this some years back when he showed test subjects 2 photographs. The first depicted 8 children in need of $300,000 for life-saving medical care. The second showed a single child who needed $300,000, the same amount of money, for life-saving medical care. Most of the subjects were willing to donate to the one child, but not to the group. These are equivalent groups. It's not the same exact people showing those things. In later research, this is the one that really floors me, Slovic showed participants 3 photos: a starving African girl, a starving African boy, and a photo of both of them together. Participants felt equivalent amounts of sympathy for each child when viewed separately, but the sympathy dropped when the children were viewed together. 2 were too many. In a stunning reversal of basic arithmetic, 1 + 1 equaled less than 1. Now this book that, I don't know, are some people being required to buy this, or is it just that some of you are being required to buy, is entirely devoted to explaining, contextualizing, and illustrating why messages are distorted in the way they are. I haven't focused so much on the business here, but there are commercial reasons, reasons that are baked into the business, and reasons, as I've discussed today, that are baked into our human wiring. I don't let the media off the hook. Media outlets come and go, and the bad ones should die. But as history shows us, it isn't necessarily the best media that live the longest and healthiest lives. A great deal of worthy media has to struggle for existence, and if you face that simple fact, you can't evade the conclusion that this is a mutual relationship. Here's a quote from Søren Kierkegaard. He's a Danish philosopher who did his greatest work in the 1840s. He was an intense media critic. And he was particularly peeved by what he said was the media's invention of the notion of the public, that there was such a thing as a unitary public opinion. It really bothered him. He called it a fiction, a phantom perpetuated on society to sell papers. And of course, you know, he has a point. The notion of a public is a kind of fiction. It's a tool used by media outlets that can't manage the nuance of 1 million individuals. We all use these notions, these myths, these shortcuts. I think the academic word is heuristics, to make decisions to function through our lives. So, as you do, consider that everyone is a media watchdog today. Every day the ground levels between the professionals and the so-called amateurs. The communication between them grows more productive, and the line that separates them grows blurrier. For better or worse, we have met the media, and increasingly, it is us. In fact, it's always been us, but we used to be able to deny it, and deny it really well. Now we have no choice but to admit it. In fact, one of the big morals of my story is that every news consumer, awash in a sea of that unfiltered information, has to function as his or her own watchdog. We have unlimited access to different information sources and to original documents. We can assess the work of reporters. All we require is the will. I'll just finish with one more Kierkegaard, if you guys can stand it. What an individual is capable of may be measured by how far his understanding is from his willing. What a person can understand, he must also make himself will. Between understanding and willing lie the excuses and the evasions. So on that rousing note, Thank you very much. I'll take questions. How's the time? Did I go too long? Huh? Any questions? Come on. Oh, good. I'll get to the ringers later. You want to pick up a microphone over there? And you would definitely not be willing to face the camera, probably. I know people were bothered by that, but don't. Go ahead. Just go ahead.
Speak loudly. Okay. So when you are filtering your media, what are some pitfalls that you face? Like, what are the biggest challenges for you as you're going through? I mean, I know that when you're, or I assume that when you're writing on the media, you have like specific stories that you're researching. But on your own, when you're consuming media?
I'm embarrassed to say that on my own time, I tend to be in flight from the media. I do read a lot of science fiction. But that said, that little admission now on the record, I try and engineer a term of art that computer geeks use, sometimes called serendipity, which is I try and put myself in the path of articles and information I wouldn't normally get. Now, you know, there are serendipity engines that are very benign and wonderful, like Arts and Letters, or the Arts and Letters Daily, or the Browser, or 3 Quarks Daily. These are really fun places to encounter stuff you don't know. I like the New Scientist, even though sometimes that information is a little dicey. You have to sort of be informed about the, they'll jump the gun a little. But the hardest part of it is going to sources of information that may challenge some of my prejudices and received wisdom. You know, I will, you know, I, like many people, half the country, I guess, or a little more than half, I am a liberal. So to read the Wall Street Journal editorial page or the National Review online can sometimes distress me, but it also informs me. I think that it's sort of incumbent on everybody to find a source of reliable information that is outside your zone of comfort. And so that is something that I try to do. In fact, I try to do it more and more so that I don't get lazy. And every time I find somebody who's a writer who I think is really smart and really good, we'll get them on the show if we can, and I will read them if they are, you know, especially if they're outside the usual suspects. I try to avoid my Rolodex as a journalist and as a news consumer, but it's tough. It's really a lot of work. Yeah. Would you come and get a mic? No, they're taping this.
With the abundance of fake pictures and fake things in the media, how can you blame like the public for, you know, in other cases not believing them or thinking that the media is the enemy?
You know what? I don't think so much blame is the issue in terms of what it does to me personally. I do feel that blame is another one of those easy, that's sort of the influencing machine analogy that I began with. It diminishes you to use the fact that the media are frequently unreliable and riddled with inaccuracies as an excuse not to question those images and not to be informed. Another thing is that the Photoshopification, though it does happen in the institutional media, and I can offer many examples, very controversial examples of that, it happens a lot more in social media. And so, you know, the media, I always try and use it as it was meant to be used when they began as a plural, as opposed to a unitary institutional idea, which is a singular. Instead of the media is, I like to say media are, because there's you know, you can't just put, you know, the New York Times in the same category as Reddit or something like that, but they're all media, you know? You know, they function differently, their sourcing is different, their purpose is different, the mechanisms whereby their business models are different, everything is different. So, you know, yeah, you should blame the people who lie to you wherever they are and use that information to avoid that information to avoid those sources in the future. There's a website that came out, it was in Scotland, we covered it on the show, that was a fact checker for all the photoshopped images that came out during Sandy, the Hurricane Sandy. You know, everything from the classic waves slamming the Statue of Liberty to a lot of other purely photoshopped images, some of which were actually just created by people on their Facebook page to express their feelings or a kind of zeitgeist, and were never intended to be newsworthy, but when things are just blindly tweeted or retweeted or reposted or something like that, you don't know where that stuff begins or ends. If you can't track something down to its source, you're under no obligation to believe it. I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. You go next. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, when you speak of the general public now contributing to media and to the news, as a news reporter, how do you feel about that? Do you feel, I somehow get the feeling that you don't approve.
No, I don't know why you would get that feeling. Actually, this whole speech was kind of an exhortation to be a responsible contributor to that space, just as, and it is true that although the book certainly spends most of its time on the disease of institutional media, or the diseases that plague it, I just thought this is an audience of techno-savvy people, so, you know, they should consider that, you know, every bit of misinformation that's retweeted, that's on the news consumer. I think it's incredible. How could we have reported on the Arab Spring without those people on the ground who were not part of institutional media? You need to present that. If you haven't vetted it and you're repeating it, whether or not you're an individual or you're an institution, you need to explain that it hasn't been vetted. I mean, the BBC would play audio from the ground in Libya and would say, we can't verify this. Well, reasonable people could disagree about whether or not they should run a tape that they can't verify. My assumption is that they were able to triangulate the source a little bit to know at least where it was done, or to see when it was done. But yeah, I think we have the opportunity to be so much better informed today. I think the leveling of that playing field is the most exciting part of this new world that we've entered. There's the collapse of time and space and distance and the growth of instant translators. I mean, it's just brilliant. I think it's fantastic. But I do think that it requires a new kind of literacy, and it begins with understanding oneself. Well, someone back here first, right? And yeah, so blue t-shirt, yeah, sorry.
You mentioned a lot of examples of bias, such as the racism statistics. What are ways that we can eliminate this kind of bias?
In ourselves?
Yeah.
Well, first, it would be useful to take that test. And I'm trying to remember what it's called. It's the Harvard Association test or something like that. There's a link for it in the book, and if I can find it while we're here without wasting too much time, I'll do that. But it's the guy who created the test says he's taken it over 200 times. He knows how it works. He's completely scoped it out. But he takes it honestly, and it's a timed thing. You have to move as quickly as you can. And he says he still comes up racist every single time. Drives him insane, because these are unconscious associations. But how useful to know that you make those associations, right? Because, you know, it's like you can't be accused of thought crimes. It's the way you behave. It's the choices you make in the world that matter. We all have things going through our minds all the time that we don't want to share. And, you know, thank goodness we don't have technology that can read our minds. But it's, you know, you may never eliminate it. It may be bred from such an early age that you'll never shed it, or maybe you will. I know some people who have improved taking the test, but it may just be that they've scoped out the test. The key thing really is to know who you are so that you behave with integrity and fairness and clarity as you move through the world. Somebody over here? Yeah. Oh, you need to turn it on or get another one.
Would you say that the rise of the internet and social media have made people more likely to challenge their own beliefs, or more likely to seek out better comfort zones?
That is an unbelievably complicated question, because all the studies suggest that what the internet and digital media, all of that stuff does is make us more of what we would have been anyway. In other words, if you want to cocoon yourself into a world where the only information you get are, you know, golfing channels or something like that, you can do that. Or if you only want to talk to people who are exactly like you, you can create a tiny little echo chamber that just fits you and your, you know, your co-believers in there, and that's fine. But the more engaged a person is in media, especially social media, the more they gather, accrue, assemble what are called weak ties. And weak ties are essentially friends who really aren't friends. You know, they're a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, right? On Facebook. Or they're some follower who just happened to like some post you did on Twitter, or you like their post or something like that. So you don't really know them, but you're sort of vaguely aware of them. It's from those weak ties that so much serendipity happens, because your close friends pretty much feel the same way you do. But the more you go further out the circle, the more you find people who don't vote the way you do, who don't look like you do, who don't make the same money that you do, and whose view of the world and experience is different from yours. And so then the question becomes, is the kind of person who engages in those social networks so curious that they're, you know, likely to assemble these ties and maybe exploit them from time to time for information or perspective? Or is being in that world making them more curious? You know, I tend to think that it's consistent with my little view that, you know, we create the worlds that we want to live in. And a rich and varied world is one in which you encounter people that you wouldn't encounter in the ordinary course of your life with people who are just like you. So Pew did a study that found that people who tended to be loners could exist in an even lonelier way online, and, you know, they needed even fewer ties and didn't want them or did without. And people who were social did not neglect their real-life flesh and blood family. They, in fact, were every bit as active with them as they did before the entrance of, you know, text messaging and Facebook and Twitter in their lives, but they just expanded their circle. And another thing, and this is a study that's in the book, and I'll just say it really fast, They once did, I think it's, I don't know how they did it, it seems kind of mean, but they put these young, like 12-year-old girls through some really stressful thing. Maybe they didn't put it through it, but they were giving a speech or something, and it was causing all of these stress hormones to sort of, rise in their bodies. And what they did is they measured the amount of these, it was wasn't cortisone. Cortisol, exactly, thank you, cortisol. So they measured the level of it, and before, and they all had elevated levels, and then they measured their levels when their mom came into the room and tested how much it dropped, and then if their mom wasn't there, when their mom was on the phone, and how much it dropped. And they found out that ultimately their stress levels dropped. Well, thank God for Ma, right? I love the fact that at least their mothers didn't make them more stressed out. But their stress, the cortisol level went way, way, way down when the mom was there in person. But it went down the same amount when they got to talk to their mom on the phone. It just took a little longer. So to say that there's no replacement for face-to-face ties, that this is just a terrible retreat from the world of real relationships, isn't strictly speaking true. It's different, but it isn't without validity and a reality of its own. So that's a big answer to that question, but I could go on. So I'll be glad I don't. Sure. He's such a dapper walk, just strolling down.
You mentioned that more and more increasingly it's now sort of the end user's responsibility to sort through the fact and the fiction. You also mentioned specifically the Arab Spring movement, how first-person reporting is increasingly common and valuable. What then in today's society do you think is the purpose of an organized media source? If we're doing the reporting and we're sorting through what's fake and what's not, why do we still need...
You doing all of that? Yeah, in the Arab Spring, there weren't, it was very difficult to get reporters on the ground because of restrictions that governments were placing in those areas. But for context, I mean, all reporting isn't just eyewitness reporting. Even if I were to grant the idea that we didn't need reporters to do any eyewitness reporting anymore, which I don't think is true. I mean, it does happen in these places, but, and it is a tremendous supplement and complement, and sometimes it's the only thing, as in the Arab Spring many times, to traditional reporting. There's still a role for traditional reporting. If it's done well, it provides context, sort of a little bit of historical knowledge. It provides a wide variety of perspectives. If it's done, I'm saying, stipulating if it's done well. The reporting of the Arab Spring on the ground is, this happened here at this place and this bomb went off. If that's the only kind of information we ever got, it would not make us informed human beings. We would need, who are these people? What's their gripe? Who's doing the attacking? Who's getting attacked? What is the broader context? What is the history of Egypt? Going back to Nasser and before that. I mean, these are things that make the world comprehensible. And you can know that something happened at this place then, but that tells you nothing. So, not that only institutional media can provide that. Amateurs can provide that kind of rich context too, and those people end up getting bought by the institutional media. So far, but they still have a few bucks. I should probably not stay in the first row though, because people will think I'm really nearsighted, so I can only see in the first row. But that's.
What do you suggest that us as viewers do when news media uses a reliable source, but that source in and of itself is biased?
You mean they call it a reliable source, or it is a reliable source? Well, what makes him or her reliable?
like it's an actual, like for example, yeah, wait. Yeah, like a vetted source.
You mean that we know who they are, but we don't trust their opinion?
No, like for example, if there's a live footage or reliable footage, for example, in Syria that depicts extreme violence or whatnot, and it's a legitimate footage, but it's not depicting the reality of the situation. But the media uses that source, and it's a legitimate source, but it's not.
But it's decontextualized.
Yes.
What do we do about that?
What do you suggest us as viewers can do?
If you mean if you don't know, or if you do know that it's decontextualized?
If we don't know.
Well, if you see something that shocks you, or even if you just care about a story, and people won't want to do this about every story, but if you care about a story, then you go and you find more than one source of news. In fact, that little chart that Miriam referred to about things to watch out for in the first hours after a shooting, in terms of the media, recognize that there's an enormous amount of fog. There's almost never a second gunman. Be wary of any story that uses another news outlet as a source. Pay attention to whether a news outlet is acknowledging what it doesn't know. Pay attention to the language the media uses. We're getting reports. We have confirmed. We have learned. We are seeking confirmation. Never, ever believe anything in the first hours of an event from an unnamed official, whether law enforcement or otherwise. They are so often wrong. Often named ones are wrong. As I mentioned in that piece, there were named officials, including the mayor and the police chief, that maligned the entire citizenry of New Orleans during Katrina because they just swallowed a lot of rumor. But, and we saw the pathetic mess CNN made after the Boston bombing, and the names are always wrong, or frequently wrong, and a lot of times they come from unnamed law enforcement officials. If they aren't named, if they aren't on the record, consider it pure speculation. Right after the Boston bombing, when they were still pursuing Tsarnaev, I became sort of obsessed with listening to the police radio, like a lot of people were. And police radio tells you nothing. It's two guys in a car who are still guessing what's going on. It's exciting, but it tells you nothing. There is so much confusion. So if you see stuff that has been decontextualized, it's most likely that they aren't consciously biased, but they're throwing crap onto the air to fill that aching void. And so you have to triangulate. You have to go to other news sources. You have to. If you rely on one, then that's what you're going to get. And like I said, then I put the responsibility back. There. It's teeny. So are we done? Should we stop? Okay. Well then, thank you very, very much.